Hello there, scholars. I decided to make a video for you instead of lecturing live, just in case you were missing due to homecoming or you felt like learning about this content on your own time. You can see this is a PowerPoint that I borrowed from Mr. Glass, who's an AP English teacher. This presentation's goal is to inform you about integrating quotations. You'll receive some tips on how to weave quotations into your writing well, and also how to properly punctuate quotations. In your literary analysis essay, if you'd like to up the sophistication, weaving short quotes into your sentences will have a huge impact on the effectiveness of your writing. Take a moment here, pause the video, and read the ineffective versus the effective sentences. The effective sentence weaves the quotation well into the sentence while expressing the meaning in a much more concise and seamless fashion. The effective method just flows much better. Grammatically, the ineffective example is fine, but you can see in terms of usage that the second one works much better. Weaving those quotations into the context of your own sentence makes a big impact. Again, take a look at these two and pause the video. You can see in these two examples, de Crèvecoeur's piece is led into in the effective sentence with a complete sentence. So when one completes a thought leading into a quotation, it really makes the quotation stand apart. Whereas in the ineffective version, you can see that it isn't woven into the piece as well. Also notice in the effective version, the voice of the writer comes out more with some of the vocabulary, and once again that emphasis using the colon leading into the quotation. We have a couple options for integrating quotations in terms of punctuation. This first example says to incorporate the quotation into your sentence, punctuating it as you would if it were not a quotation. Mukherjee argues in favor of an acculturation model that differs from both the enforced assimilation of a melting pot and the Canadian model of a multicultural mosaic. You can see a couple things here. You do see a parenthetical reference. Notice there is no author's name in the parenthetical reference, just a page number, because the author's name is mentioned right here. If Mukherjee's name was not in the sentence, you would need to include it in the parenthetical reference. Notice that the research itself is just tied right into the sentence. You have the lead in here, kind of summarizing what the quote will be about, and the quote is just seamlessly tied right into the sentence. That is called embedding a quotation. Sometimes you might need to change your quotation to clarify for the reader to whom a word refers. Like in this case, there's a pronoun that's changed. In other cases, you might need to change the verb's ending so you can maintain a consistent verb tense in your writing. Again, in this example, you see this quote is woven in. Rodriguez describes his parents as no longer his parents in a cultural sense, and it goes on. So you have some writing here, you have the quote, and then some analysis after. If you're about to use a quotation that takes up a full sentence, then you can lead into it in a couple different ways. If it's something like a research paper that you're using, you can use words that attribute ahead of time. That one handout I gave you that's like 200 or 300 words to say the word says be a super resource for this type of technique. Notice if it is a complete sentence, you're going to have a comma and you will capitalize the quotation there. Generally speaking, we would need a parenthetical reference in these situations. Notice here that Elaine Pagel asks, whom do we include in the American Dream? The question mark is included inside of the quotation marks here because the question mark correlates with the quotation itself. You would not use the technique shown on the previous slide if you are leading into a quotation that is not a complete sentence. Both of these particular examples just seem awkward, and on top of the fact that they're awkward, it's not appropriate to capitalize the M here because the quote is not a complete sentence. The whole main idea is if you are leading into quotation with a speech tag, you need to have a complete sentence quote to follow it. Here, it would be great to find another word than said. On top of that, this quote just kind of leaves the reader feeling like there's a fragment taking place. If you use a full sentence on your own to introduce another full sentence by the quoted author, you'll use a colon like you had seen on one of the previous slides. So here you see that you have a complete thought here, and then the colon, and then you have the quotation set up as a complete sentence. You do capitalize right here because the quote is a complete thought. So one might ask, what's the difference when I am integrating a quotation? Do I use a colon or a comma? You can see the difference here. In this situation, Jacob Needleman says it best, you have a complete thought, one independent clause before the quote, so you will use a colon if the quote is a complete sentence. In the next example, your quote is a complete thought. However, Jacob Needleman says is an incomplete thought. It doesn't have the direct object. The quote itself is the direct object. Therefore, you do not have a complete independent clause, so you'll begin with a comma. When you utilize quotations, if the complete sentence you're quoting has a capital letter in the original text, you should also capitalize the quotation unless, as you see here, you are beginning with the word that. When you begin with the word that, you're creating a direct object. So in that case, you would not capitalize the letter. Notice the letter T here is in brackets and lowercase. That indicates to the reader that the writer of the essay has taken the quote and changed it. So whatever is in brackets is different than the original. Sometimes you need to do that just to maintain the appropriate tense or grammatical structure. Alright, so let's change this to a W. When you have a quotation that is split up, maybe because of dialogue, maybe you put some analysis in the middle, be certain that you do not capitalize the beginning of a dependent clause. If you split up the original sentence, maintain its capitalization. Remember that punctuation goes within closing quotation marks, except if the parenthetical reference follows the quotation. In that case, you're going to put your punctuation after the parenthetical reference. If your punctuation, like colons and semicolons, are not a part of the quotation, put them outside of the closing quotation marks, right here. Question marks can be a little tricky. If a question mark, exclamation point, or dash is part of the original quotation, then it needs to go inside of the closing quotation mark. Whereas if your question mark or exclamation point or dash is not a part of the quote but is a part of the entire sentence, then it needs to go outside of the quotation marks. At times you might need to use a longer quote, but try not to do that. You should not have more than 25% of your essay in quotations. If you get that high, you have way too many quotations. That being said, if for some reason you need to use a longer quote, you have a certain setup that you need to use. So if the type text takes up more than 3 lines, you need to use a block quote. You'll begin it as a new line of text. It will be single spaced, not double like the rest of your sentence. It will be indented 1 inch from the margin, no quotation marks, and your parenthetical reference goes outside the final punctuation rather than within the quote like you would for a shorter quotation. In this particular example, you can see that the piece is indented. It should be single space. It's probably a little hard to tell because you don't have a double-spaced essay, but notice it's indented from the left line here, and then it's also different with where your parenthetical reference goes. It is outside of the punctuation. Now, the parenthetical references for your lit analysis essays probably will just have the author's last name, like Hawthorne, for instance, or Poe, because your electronic versions don't have pagination on them. If they do have a set page that is published on them, then you would need to include the page number. However, most of your stories do not. So as a goal for your next essay, whether it's a goal that you write down and we sign upon or not, try to do your best in integrating quotations into your essay and be certain that you are using quotations for support in your body paragraphs. Let me know if you have any questions.